Hilchos Maachalos Asuros Perek Sheni, the laws of forbidden foods, chapter 2. Yesterday, we spent all our time on the differentiating signs between kosher and non-kosher birds, or animals or fish, because that in itself is a mitzvah, to know the signs that distinguish between kosher and non-kosher species. Today, the Rambam is all occupied with the prohibition against consuming non-kosher species. So we'll talk about consuming non-kosher animals, talk about consuming non-kosher birds, and then we're going to get at length into the idea of shrutzim, the insects, not consuming insects of all types. So we begin with the animals. Says the Rambam, take a look at the verse on the screen. Miklal shenemar, implied in that which it says, v'chol behema mafreses parsa, v'sheisas shesa shtei proses, malas gera. This is the verse in the Torah that permits kosher food. It says any animal that has split hooves, totally divided, because split hooves, we didn't get into it yesterday, but split hooves doesn't just mean in the front. It's got to be split all the way through. If you were to pick up the animal's leg, you would see a split going all the way down. That's the extra word here. It's totally split, and it chews its cud. So the verse, this is the full verse that the Rambam was quoting here on the screen, it ends off, Oisa toichelu. That's the one you can eat. Now, this verse is not a commandment to eat kosher meat. There's no mitzvah to eat kosher meat. If you don't want to eat meat, you can stay away from anything. It's okay. That's right. The point that the Torah is making is that this is what's allowed to be eaten. Shemei I derive from here, shekol she'eina malas geiro mafreses parsa asura, that any animal that's not chewing its cud or doesn't have split hooves is forbidden. In other words, the reason the Torah couches this verse in a positive sense is to tell us that if you don't meet these conditions, then it's forbidden. Now, we've had this principle a few times in the Rambam already. V'lav haba miklal aseh asehu. Whenever we derive a negative prohibition from a positive terminology in the Torah, it has the status of a positive commandment. In other words, you can never get punished for it. You won't get lashes or anything like that. You're not allowed to eat non-kosher meat, but it's only derived from a positive terminology. Now, that's part one. There's a second part to this prohibition. Uva gomol, uva chazir, uva arneves, uva shafan. When talking about a camel, pig, rabbit, and a hyrax, which is a type of hare, nemar, about those four animals it says clearly in negative terms. That's the verse here. Ezeh loy toichlu, mimale hagera o mimafrise haparsa v'gomer. The following are the animals you should not eat from among those that chew their cud or have split hooves, because all these animals have one sign. Right? The camel, the rabbit, and the hare, they all chew their cud, and the pig only has split hooves. So over there it says, no eating them. So here you have a clear negative commandment against these four species, even though they have one of the kosher signs. So from here we can derive one of the principles in the Torah is a kal v'chomer, a fortiori in fancy Latin. If the Torah forbids by a clear negative prohibition animals that have one of the kosher signs, so certainly other non-kosher beasts or animals that have no signs at all, the prohibition against eating them is also a negative prohibition. Over and above the positive commandment, which is derived from the implication of the words you can eat kosher, i.e. implying that you cannot eat non-kosher. Bottom line, we have one positive status commandment and one negative status commandment over all non-kosher meat. Therefore, says the Rambam, lefichach halacha beis, therefore, kala oichel mi basar behema v'chaya tmeya. Kezayis, anybody who eats an olive-sized portion, because that's like the minimum amount to be considered a proper eating. Anybody who eats an olive-sized portion from animal or beast that are non-kosher, loike min haTorah, you're liable to get lashes biblically. Bein sha'achal min habasar, bein sha'achal min hachelev, doesn't matter what part of the animal you ate, the meat or the fats. Even though with kosher animals, there's a big difference between meat and fats. With non-kosher animals, once you're in the category of non-kosher meat, everything in the non-kosher animal is non-kosher, whether it's the meat or the fat. The Torah doesn't differentiate when it comes to impure things.
So what happens if you eat less than a kazayas?
Less than a kazayas is prohibited, but we can't hold you liable for punishment. You can only get lashes for eating the requisite amount. Less than the requisite amount, it's prohibited, but you don't get lashes. Now comes the question of cannibalism. Says the Rambam, ha'adam, human being, afal pi shenemar boy, even though he is described clearly in the Torah, by Yehi ha'adam lenefesh chaya, that after Hashem blew the soul into Adam's nostrils, what does it say in the Torah? The Adam, the human, became a nefesh chaya, a living soul, a living being. And the word here that's used is chaya, which literally means beast, like in the context of beasts when it comes to non-kosher meat. Einoi miklal mine chaya balas parsa. Nevertheless, exactly what you said before we started the class, it's not included in the beasts for kosher and non-kosher because it doesn't have a hoof. The guiding words in the Torah for kosher and non-kosher consumption are animals that have hooves. Humans don't have that. Lefichach einei beleisaseh. Therefore, fascinatingly, according to the Rambam, they're not included in the prohibition against eating non-kosher meat. However, they are part of the other derivative commandment, where it says you can only eat kosher animals. That implies anything that's not that you cannot. So therefore, says the Rambam, if somebody consumes human flesh or human fat, whether they're alive or dead, we can't give you lashes because you're not part of the negative commandment. But you are forbidden by dint of a positive commandment. Because the Torah counts out 7 types of living beings. And it says, Zois hachaya asher toichlu. So there's a bit of a problem with this verse here because the verse that the Rambam is quoting is not stated with relation to the 7 types of beasts. By the 7 types of beasts, it says, Zois habehema asher toichelu. But there is a verse, Zois hachaya asher toichlu, also about kosher. The point is, there's a clear verse that says, the following are the animals that you can eat, which implies, hakol shehu chutz mehen, anything which is not in the category of these 7 animals, lo yiteichlu, you shall not eat. And when a negative commandment is derived from a positive terminology, it has the status of a positive commandment. So at least that's holding you back from eating human meat. I should know the other commentaries argue on the Rambam say there's no prohibition at all to eat human meat. It's a fascinating concept because you would think in your head like cannibalism should be completely disqualified. But according to the Rambam, it is forbidden. And there are other issues though with cannibalism because you're dealing with Eiver min achai. If he's live, you're taking limbs from a living being. That's a separate thing. But even according to those that say it was prohibited, like you were saying before the class, if it would be a case of pikuach nefesh, then everything goes out the window. But by basic law, definitely should stay away from it, at least on a rabbinic level. That is as far as animals and beasts go. Now that Rambam moves to birds. Halacha daled ha'oichel kazayis mibasar oif tameh. Somebody eats an olive portion. By the way, olive portion in today's measurement is about an ounce. So 1 ounce of non-kosher bird meat. Loika min ha'Torah. You also get lashes biblically. Shenemar, because it says, here's the verse about the birds. Ve'es'ela teshaktu min ha'oif lo ye'achlu. The following should be treated by you as disgusting. From among the birds, they shall not be eaten. That's the negative commandment. And you also transgress a positive commandment following the same mechanism. Shenemar, as it says, kol tzipor tohira toichelu. That's the bottom here. All kosher birds you may eat. Hatmeya lo toichelu, which implies if it's a non-kosher bird, you cannot eat it. Now again, that's a negative commandment derived from positive terminology. So it has the status only of a positive commandment, but the point is that when you eat birds that are non-kosher, you get both violations. Same thing from a non-kosher fish. You eat an olive-sized portion, like you get lashes. Shenemar. Again, here we have a positive and a negative. Check it out. One verse says, they shall be disgusting to you, you shall not consume their flesh. That's a clear negative commandment. You also transgress a positive commandment, because it says, any fish that has a fin and a scale, you may eat. Miklal, that implies, a fish who doesn't have a fin and a scale, may not be eaten. Bottom line, from these 4 halachot, we have the following that we learn. Anybody who eats dog tameh, behema, v'chaya tmeya, oif tameh. Anybody who eats a non-kosher fish, non-kosher animal, beast or bird, bitel mitzvah saseh, v'avar alei saseh, has nullified a positive commandment and he has transgressed a negative commandment. And now we move on for the rest of the chapter to the topic of shratzim, of insects. Chagav tameh. Yesterday, the final category, or the second to last category which we learned, was the locusts. So the Rambam hasn't mentioned them yet. Is there a prohibition for eating a non-kosher locust? So the Rambam says a non-kosher locust, harehu bichlal sheretz ha'oif, doesn't have its own unique prohibition. It's included in the prohibition against flying insects. The word sheretz is very specific. It means a teeming insect, an insect which reproduces new offspring, but flying ones. So locusts are included in that category. If you eat a olive-sized portion from a flying, teeming insect, you get lashes for all the categories, not just locusts are included. Shenemar, because it says, here it is, koil, or in the Torah it's v'choil, sheretz ha'oif, tamehu lachem, lo ye'ochelu. All flying insects are impure for you, they shall not be eaten. Ve'izeu sheretz ha'oif, what's in the category of flying insects, besides for locusts? So we have locusts here on the side, and then we have the four that the Rambam mentions. Zvuv, like a fly, or yatush, or a mosquito, that's over here, v'tzira udvaira, and a hornet and a bee. Sorry, this is the fly, this is the mosquito, this is the bee, this is the hornet. Yeah. V'chayetzaben, and anything like them. These are teeming creatures, they reproduce, and they're flying insects. Now, there's another category of sheretz. Says the Rambam Malachavav, ha'eichel kazayis misheretz ha'oretz. If somebody eats an olive-sized portion from the teeming insects on the ground, these do not fly. Loika, they get lashes, because it's a separate verse. Shenemar, here's the verse here. V'chol ha'sheretz ha'shoretz al ha'oretz. Notice the Torah's expression here. All teeming, creepy crawlies that teem on the earth, sheketzu lo yachel. It's disgusting, shall not be eaten. Ve'zehu sheretz ha'oretz. What's an example of insects that teem on the ground? Snakes and scorpions. That's over here. This is a snake. Here's a scorpion. And v'chipushis. That's a beetle. This one here, v'nadol, and a centipede. V'chayetze, behind anything like that. Yeah, that's an actual centipede right there. Many, many, many feet. These are insects that do not fly, but they reproduce. They're shrutzim on the ground. Now, in this category, or similar to this category, are halacha zayin. Ushmayna shratzim ha'amurim b'Torah. There are 8 rodents mentioned in the Torah. Now, fascinatingly, these rodents appear in the Torah in the context of non-kosher food, yet it never says in the Torah you cannot eat them. All it says is that they have impurity. They give you ritual impurity. So here we have a fascinating rule because of this. The Shmayna shratzim ha'amurim b'Torah. There are 8 rodents, teeming animals, mentioned in the Torah, shehein, which they are. Ha'choyled, the weasel, you have all the pictures over here. V'ha'achbar, and the mouse. V'hatzav, and the toad. V'ha'anaka, and the porcupine, and the hedgehog. V'ha'koyach, and the chameleon. V'ha'latah, and the lizard. V'ha'chemet, and the snail. V'ha'tinchemes, and the mole. All of these 8 animals, ha'oichel mibasaram ka'adasha loike. If you consume from their flesh a lentil size, much smaller than an olive size, you already get lashes. Why? Shiur achilasan keshir tumasan. Here, the requisite amount for eating them follows the requisite amount for their contracting or transmitting ritual impurity. Because all it says in the Torah is that they are tameh, they are impure, but they're in the context of non-kosher food, so there's a prohibition against eating them as well, but it's defined by their impurity amount, which is a lentil. All 8 can combine to create a lentil size. You have a tiny little piece of toad, a little piece of mouse, a little piece of weasel, and together they're a lentil size, it's prohibited. When do we say this? When you eat these rodents after they're dead. But if you cut off a living limb from a living rodent, and you eat them, now it's guided by the other rules. You only get lashes if you have a full olive-sized portion of flesh. And again, while they're alive, all the types combine to equal an olive-sized portion. If you ate a complete limb from one of these rodents after it died, so here, and we'll see this later in the chapter as well, when you eat a complete unit of something, there's many times more reason to be strict. But over here, even though you're eating a complete limb, because it's dead, it follows the rules of dead rodents. And you don't get lashes till there's a lentil size. So you snap off a leg of a lizard, doesn't have a lentil size, you're not going to be liable. the blood of these 8 rodents and their flesh, mitzaref lekahadasha, can combine to the lentil size. The blood is considered like the flesh. Provided that the blood is intertwined with the meat. It hasn't been separated, as we'll see in a second. Similarly, a snake, even though it's not on this list of the 8 rodents, its blood can combine with its flesh to create an olive-sized portion and get you lashes. Because its blood and flesh are not differentiable. Differentiable, is that a word? They're not different. Even though it's not on the list of the 8 rodents that contract or transmit ritual impurity, but because it has this natural phenomenon about itself where its flesh and blood mix very well, so they combine to create the requisite size to get you lashes. Same thing applies to all other insects that are not transmitting ritual impurity. If their blood is intertwined with their meat, they combine to their requisite size of an olive size to get you lashes. Now, if the blood of the rodents left their bodies, it was not now combined with the meat, and you gathered, let's say, a cup of this blood, and you ate it, like olav b'kazayis, if you consume an olive-sized portion of that blood, you'll get lashes. So long as the witnesses watching you warned you on account of eating teeming animals. Because that's the prohibition you're transgressing here. You're eating blood from a teeming animal. But if they're watching you hold this cup of blood and they say, hey, you can't eat blood, pato, you'll actually be exempt. Because for blood, as we'll see in chapter 6, a whole chapter about eating blood, the prohibition in the Torah is only against eating the blood of animals, beasts, or birds, not insects. So for the blood of the insects, you'll only be held accountable if you're warned against eating an insect, not against eating blood. And the Rambam lets us know, halacha yud aleph, kol hashi'urin umach lekaisam, all of these requisite amounts and the differences between them. In other words, when you're liable for an olive, when you're liable for a lentil size, halacha leMoshe miSinai. All of these requisite amounts, all these measurements have been received as an oral tradition directly from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. Moving on to the next category. So we've had Sheretz ha'oif, the flying insects. We've had Sheretz ha'aretz, the teeming insects on the ground. Third category. Ha'oichel kazayis misheretz hamayim. Somebody eats a olive-sized portion from insects or teeming animals in the water. This, as we'll see, is a really broad category. It's not just insects. Loika min ha'Torah, you get lashes. Shenemar, it says, Al teshaktu es nafshei seichem b'chol hasheretz hashoyretz. Do not disgust your souls with all types of teeming animals. V'lo yisitamu bahem, and do not become impure by them. Since it says all teeming animals, so we now have a third category. Harei kol al b'lav zeh, included in this prohibition is sheretz ha'aretz, v'sheretz ha'oif, v'sheretz hamayim. The teeming animals on the ground, the teeming flying animals, and the teeming animals in the water. Ezehu sheretz hamayim. What qualifies to be a teeming animal in the water? 2 extremes. Elu habriyos haktanos. On the one hand, we have the small creatures, like the worms and the leeches that live in water. That's these guys, worms and leeches on the left side. And it also includes the habriyos hagdolos biyoser, the big creatures, shehin chayos hayam, the beasts of the sea, klal shel davar, which the inclusive principle for this is kol she'enei b'tzuras hadagim, whatever does not have the form of fish. Loy dag tamei v'loy dag toher, not a kosher or non-kosher fish. Kigoin, for example, what's an example of a water animal that doesn't have the form of a fish? Kelev hamayim, the water dog. Water dog is the seal. And the hadalfin, most commentaries translate this as a dolphin, so I don't know why it doesn't have a form of a fish. But others say that dolphin is another kind of creature that doesn't look like a fish. V'atzvardea, and the frog, huh? I know, but so do many fish. And it has a form of a fish. I mean, look at it. It's got, you would say it's a fish. And the frog. Point is, they're animals that live in the water that don't look like a fish. They're also considered sheretz hamayim. They're considered the water-teeming animals, and you're liable for eating an olive-sized portion of their flesh. Now we have a fascinating topic. Elu haminin, says the Rambam Malacha Yud Gimel. Elu haminin shenivroin ba'ashpos u'begufei hanavelos. The types of bugs or insects that are created in garbage heaps and in carcasses, like what's called in Hebrew, rima v'seleya. Rima v'seleya means maggots and worms. She'ena nivrayin mizachar u'nekeva. They are not created from male and female unions. Ela min haglolim shehisrichu v'chayetza behen. Rather from garbage that has gone bad. What we call in today's world spontaneous generation. Hena nikrayin reimes al haaretz. They're called in the Torah crawlers of the ground. They're not sherets because they don't reproduce, but they simply crawl on the ground. If you eat from them an olive-sized portion, you also get lashes. Shenemar, because it says a clear verse, you shall not, it's the end of this verse here, you shall not cause your soul impurity with all teeming animals that crawl on the ground. Even if they don't further reproduce. The other expression in the other verse, that the teeming animal which teems on the ground, that's one that reproduces from male and female. So there's another category over here. Talk about it in a second. Worms that come in fruits and vegetables. But before we get there, I want to just read you a letter from the Rebbe, because there was a scientist who asked the Rebbe this question about spontaneous generation. The Rambam is clearly indicating that it exists. And today he says that when you look under microscopes, there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. It's always recreated from some kind of bacteria, male bacteria, female bacteria. There's always a male and female getting together. So this is actually an English letter. So this is literally the Rebbe's words.
There's some worms, for example, that are hermaphroditic. In other words, they have male and female.
Or that, yeah.
They can actually
within themselves.
Without mating.
But there has to be a male-female component, is what this guy had said. So the Rebbe writes to him, during our conversation I told you that I had studied this matter from the scientific point of view when I was in France, and I have acquainted myself with the authoritative scientific books and authors dealing with this question. The only thing that I was able to ascertain scientifically, and this is beautiful, is that science does not deny the possibility of spontaneous generation, but only declares that so far observation has only shown that certain instances of what was believed in the past to be spontaneous generation were in fact not spontaneous. That's all. It's the negative. It's negating other evidence that we had. He continues, surely it should be axiomatic that so long as science does not come out with a categorical declaration that spontaneous generation is impossible, there's no need to attempt to reinterpret the sayings of our sages. Because this guy was saying that maybe the sages didn't mean spontaneous generation. They meant, inobservable spontaneous generation. They were saying, no, science never totally denied the possibility. I repeat, I carefully studied this matter in France, where most of the scientific area in this region in this area was done. That was Pasteur. That's how you pronounce his name, right? He was the guy who...
he was the guy who invented heating liquids. Pasteurize, when you pasteurize liquids like milk.
Oh, is that why it's called pasteurizing? Wow. So he was very involved in this, also in this field of spontaneous generation. But the Rebbe says, I was in France, that's where he was doing this research. And I have not found any scientific conclusion that certain low forms of living matter cannot come into being from non-living material. As a matter of fact, many modern biologists believe that it is possible that certain low forms may have developed through chemical processes from non-living matter, even if this cannot be demonstrated under satisfactorily controlled conditions. Because every lab tests runs that risk, right? That if you're in a controlled environment, now things won't act in the way they naturally act. So in a way, you're kind of in a catch-22 in which you can never really, really determine the truth of something because you're always in a controlled environment. The point is that I was saying there are modern biologists who believe in the possibility of it. And he concludes...
Yeah, but they can't prove it.
No, exactly. However, in regard to the question of spontaneous generation, there is no room whatsoever to explain away the position of our sages in this matter. This is in as much comes in area of practical halacha and in plain categorical terms. In other words, it is not a case of conjecture, as you write, this guy, I don't know who he is, about the explanation which you heard. Namely, if there were spontaneous generation, then the halacha would be such and such. That's not what it says. The halacha states explicitly that there are species which come into being from non-living matter, and therefore the din is such and such, which means that we accept as a baseline that there are such species. If the Torah would say, if the Rambam would say, if you come across this type of animal, then you should know this and that. Then Torah is giving conjecture onto those types of living beings. But that's not the Rambam here. The Rambam here says, Elu haminin, right? These are the types that get created in these garbage heaps. This is their law. In other words, part of the ruling is that we're also ruling on the existence of these beings. So hence, you cannot just explain away the sage's position. Rather, you have to say that it's a real deal. And the Rebbe is just saying, they don't need justification because science never flat out denied their possibility of existence. Anyways, just thought it was interesting, and let's continue.
It goes back to ex nihilo, creating something from nothing. It can't be done.
No. So even the Rebbe says it's from non-living matter. No, he's saying it's from non-living matter. Right? The Rambam does say that these things came into being from the garbage. The point is only that the chemical process doesn't involve a male-female reproduction. That's the point. No one's saying these things come out of thin air. We're saying they came out of the garbage, not out of male and female. That's the point. Anyway, Yudalit. Elu haminin hanivroin ba'peres uva Maachalos. Let's talk about the types of maggots or worms that are created inside fruit and food. Im parshu v'yatzu la'aretz. It's a bit complex, the details here. If they leave the food and go onto the ground, afal pisha chazru l'toicha eichel, even if they then return into the food, misha achal mehan kazayis loike. Once you eat an olive-sized portion of it, you get lashes. Shanamar, here's the verse. L'chol hasheretz, hashoyretz al ha'aretz. Any teeming animal that teems onto the ground. So this is an additional verse to include an additional category. Lesser elo sheparshu la'aretz, to forbid these worms, I guess, that separated onto the ground. Avolim loy parshu, so long as they haven't separated from the fruits. Mutar lechal apri v'hatelas shebasoichai, by dry law you can eat the fruit with the worm inside. I'm not sure who would want to do it, but it hasn't left the fruit, it's permitted, right? As the famous joke goes, what's worse than finding a worm in your apple? Finding half a worm in your apple. But that's allowed. Now, there's a very important caveat for this rule. Tesvav bamed dvarim amurim. When is this whole discussion true? Left the fruit, didn't leave the fruit. Shehisliya ha'oichel achar shenekar min haaretz. Is if the food became wormy only after it was detached from the ground. Aval im hisliya v'hu mechubar. But if there's a possibility that the fruit became wormy while it was attached to the tree or to the ground, then the worm, even if it's inside the produce, is forbidden as though it's even as though it left the fruit. Shal haaretz nivres, because it was created on the land while it was attached to the tree. The like in Allah, and you get lashes. V'im safek asura, whenever you're in doubt, it's forbidden.
I would think it would be the other way around.
You would think, but no, because when it's attached to the tree, it's like it's already on the ground. So this is where the halacha comes from, which is actually very common today, even today when we have so much scientific advancement. Lefichach, therefore, kol mine peres, shadarkon lahasliya kashehein mechubarim. Any type of fruit about which we know that it's natural to become wormy while they're attached to the ground, lo yoichal ad sheyiv de kapri mitoicha. You cannot eat it until you check the fruit from the inside, like you're saying. But dates, you gotta slice them, because they could have worms inside, which could have been created while they're on the tree, and then it's forbidden to be eaten. Some rabbis in Israel say even strawberries should be done. You do that before, or raspberries, fruit that could potentially be a worm inside it.
I think
you have to check before you eat. Shema yesh boy telas, maybe there's a worm in it. If the fruit remained after being detached from the ground for 12 months, after 12 months you could eat it without checking, because no worm lasts in a fruit more than 12 months. We said before that if the worm in the fruit leaves the fruit and goes into the ground, it's forbidden. What if it just went into the atmosphere, didn't hit the ground? Or only part of them touched the ground. Or they left the fruit after they died. Or you find the worm inside the seed, inside the fruit, not in the flesh of the fruit. Or you had two apples, one attached to the other, and the worm left one apple and went right into the other apple. In all these cases, they're only forbidden out of doubt. You don't get lashes. What about a worm that's inside, not a fruit, but a living being? You have a worm that's found inside the stomach of a fish, or in the brain of an animal's head, or it's found just in meat of an animal. Asura, all these worms are forbidden because they surely came from the outside. But salted fish which became wormy, that's actually, any worms in there are permitted, because they are like fruit that became wormy after being detached. You can eat them all at once with the worm inside them. Also, if you have water sitting in a bucket and starts sprouting bugs. Those bugs can be eaten with the water, drunk with the water. Shanemar, as it says about fish, v'choil or koil asher loy snapir v'kaskeses. Is this the right verse? Yeah. Koil asher loy snapir v'kaskeses b'mayim bayamim uvanecholim oisam techelu. Whatever has fins or scales, and it exists in the water, the seas, or the rivers, them you can eat. Klemar, this means b'mayim ubayamim uvanecholim. Only in water, bodies of water, or seas or rivers, is that where the governing law applies, that whatever has a fin or scale you can eat, and not you can't eat. But once you're in a bucket, it's not a body of water anymore, it's water in a cistern, then whether it has fins or scales or not, even in these bugs, are allowed to be eaten. If a water insect was created in a pit, or a ditch, or a cave, holding water, since they're not flowing water, they're stagnant water, they're treated as water in a bucket, and it's permitted. You can bend over, drink with no worries. Even though you know you're going to be swallowing while you drink from those thin little bugs. Again, the rule applies. When do we say you can just dip into the water and drink it? Is if the insects hadn't left the place they were created. But if the bug left the water, even though it returns to the bucket or to the pit, now it's forbidden. What if it only left the water onto the rim or to the wall of the bucket or the barrel, and then it slipped back down? Mutter, it's actually permitted. Also, if it went to the wall of the pit or the wall of the cave and it went back down, it's all permitted. A guy is straining liquid. He's straining wine, he's straining vinegar or beer. And then he eats any gnats or mosquitoes or worms that he filtered out. So here, because you filtered them out and they're separate now, you get lashes for whatever category they fit into. If they're just water insects, water insects. If they're flying and water insects, you get both lashes. Even if they went back into the bucket after you strained them, because bottom line, they left the place of their creation. Now they're separate units, and you eat them, you're liable. But if you didn't strain them, you can simply drink them without no worries, as we explained. Now that Rambam gives us a general caveat/rule when it comes to consumption. The term that we kept using in this chapter was you have to eat an olive-sized. That's the amount. But that is only when you consume an olive-sized portion from a larger creature. Or you combine two parts of small creatures of the same type till you eat an olive-sized portion. But if you eat an entire creature, that's even if it's less, this is called beria. Beria means a complete creature. Then, yes, you get lashes biblically, even if it's smaller than a mustard seed. Whether you ate it alive or dead, so even if it became moldy almost and it lost its form, you ate it all, you get lashes. A tiny mosquito, but it's a full mosquito, you get lashes just for the full mosquito.
But if you don't wash the salad properly, in these little bugs on there.
Little bug, that's why it's so important. Exactly. Now, for that reason, on the flip side, you have an ant that lost even one of its legs, and now it's not a complete creature. And you have to have an olive-sized portion to make you get lashes. Therefore, you eat a complete fly or a complete mosquito, whether alive or dead, you get lashes on account of one category, the flying insect. Now, with this logic, you can get multiple lashes for eating one bug. What if one creature enters into all three categories? It's a flying insect, it's a water insect, and it's a teeming on the ground insect. It had wings. And it walks on the ground like other insects, doesn't just fly. And it also reproduced in water. And you ate the whole creature, you'll get 3 sets of lashes, because you ate one insect that has 3 different categories.
Regardless of what stage it was in its life.
Right, that's true. You're going to see it in a second. If somehow it also had the category of being created in fruit. So it was spontaneously generated, but with the power to bear offspring. Now I'll get 4 lashes, because it's in 4 categories. If it can then also reproduce, like a chamish, you get 5 lashes. If you can also include it into the category of a non-kosher bird, besides being a flying insect, it's like some big flying creature, you can get the maximum of 6 lashes for eating one creature. Mishum oif tameh, a non-kosher bird. Mishum sheretz oif, a flying insect. Mishum sheretz haaretz, a teeming on the ground insect. Mishum sheretz hamayim, a water insect. Mishum reimes ala haaretz, a crawling on the ground because it came from the garbage. Or mishum telas haperes, and for worms in the fruit. Bein shach lakula, bein shach mimena kazayis, whether you ate the whole creature or a olive size of it. Lefichach, therefore, ha'oichel nimala, ha'payrachas. If you eat a flying water ant, like a chamish malkias, you'll get 5 sets of lashes. Now, the final case, follow this. Risek nemalim, you crushed a whole bunch of ants, and by crushed we mean dismembered at some point, so they're not complete creatures anymore. The hevi achas shlema, and then you have crushed ants almost an olive size. And then you bring one full ant, you combine it to the crushed ants, and through adding the live ant, you made the whole pile into an olive size. Like a sheish malkias. Here you get 6 sets of lashes. 5 for the one ant, if it's the flying water ant. And now that you've eaten a olive size, you will get lashes mishum kazayis minivlas hatmeim, for eating an olive size from the impure non-kosher animals. Now, even though non-kosher animals don't have this additional prohibition, because they're prohibited anyways by virtue of being non-kosher meat, here, it's quite a complex discussion in the commentaries, but the bottom line is, since it only becomes an olive size by using the live ant, so the live ant is where the prohibition first falls, and then it expands to the rest of the olive size portion of ants. And when an isser expands, when it encompasses more things, called isser kailil, then the rest of the olive size can get the status of prohibition of non-kosher meat, and therefore you'll be liable 6 lashes, 5 for the ant and 1 for the rest of the crushed ants as well.